April 2nd, 1855, somewhere southwest of El Paso, Texas. Nelson Lee never thought much about silence, not until that night. The kind of silence that settles over a camp of 19 exhausted men after the fires burn low and the mules finally stop braying. The kind that makes you think you're safe. He'd just finished his sentry shift. 1 o'clock in the morning. His boots were caked with dust from pacing the perimeter, watching the darkness beyond their camp along the Rio Grande. Nothing. No movement in the scrub brush, no eyes reflecting firelight, just the endless expanse of Comanche country stretching out in every direction, invisible under the spring moon. Lee reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his prized possession. A new pocket watch, the kind that could be set to sound an alarm. He'd bought it specifically for this journey, determined to keep the caravan running on schedule. Every morning at 3:30, that little mechanism would chime and he'd rouse the men. Regimented, orderly, professional. He wound the spring, set the alarm, and crawled into his bedroll. The watch ticked softly near his head, comforting, civilized. A small piece of order in this raw wilderness. Around him, his companions slept. William Akins, his business partner, who'd convinced him this mule drive would make them rich. Thomas Martin and John Stewart, hired hands who needed the work. 15 others, whose names he knew, whose families waited for them, whose lives were about to end. The camp smelled of wood smoke and horses. The Rio Grande whispered nearby. Lee closed his eyes. Then the screaming started. His eyes snapped open to chaos. Pure, incomprehensible chaos. The camp was still shrouded in darkness, except for the dying embers of their fires, casting just enough light to reveal shapes. Dark figures moving through the tents. War whoops splitting the night. Sounds that didn't seem human. Lee grabbed for his rifle. His hand found the stock, just as something looped around his chest. A rope, yanked tight. He was jerked upward and sideways simultaneously, the rifle tumbling from his grasp. Before he could scream, before he could even process what was happening, he hit the ground hard. Hands, multiple hands holding him down, his wrists wrenched behind his back, rawhide biting into his skin. The sounds. God, the sounds. Men screaming, not yelling, not shouting, screaming, the wet thud of tomahawks. More war cries, designed to paralyze, to terrify, to announce that death had arrived on horseback. Lee's face was pressed into the dirt. He could see almost nothing. Just boots running past. The flash of firelight on painted skin. A glimpse of a face. Black, demonic black paint, covering a warrior's features, making him look like something from a nightmare. How many? 10? 20? 100? In the darkness and confusion, Lee couldn't tell. They seemed to be everywhere at once. The attack lasted minutes, maybe 10, maybe less. When you're bound on the ground listening to your friends die, time becomes meaningless. Then, as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. The war whoops faded to commands in a language Lee didn't understand. He could hear men groaning, whimpering, the snort of horses being gathered. Rough hands hauled him to his feet. His legs nearly gave out. Around him, the camp was destroyed. Tents slashed open, supplies scattered, and bodies. He forced himself not to look too closely. 3 other men stood near him, also bound. Akins, Martin, Stewart. 4 survivors out of 19. The Comanche warriors stripped them naked with efficient brutality, then threw buckskin shirts and leggings at their feet. Put these on. The message was clear even without words. You're not white settlers anymore. You're captives now. Lee's hands shook as he dressed. His mind raced. The sentinels. Where were the sentinels? How had an entire war party approached without any warning? Then he heard it. A tiny mechanical sound. Cheerful. Absurdly out of place. His pocket watch, still in his vest, which now lay trampled in the dirt. The alarm he'd set, 3:30 in the morning. Right on schedule. A Comanche warrior picked up the vest. Curious. Shook it. The chiming continued. The warrior's eyes widened. He called to the others. They gathered around this magical object that sang on command. One of them thrust the watch at Lee, gesturing. Make it do that again. Nelson Lee, surrounded by the mutilated bodies of his companions, stood in his buckskin and demonstrated his pocket watch for his captors. The absurdity of it would haunt him for years. If he lived that long, this is the story of what it was like to be hunted by the Comanche, to go from safety to captivity in heartbeats, to face warriors who had perfected the art of the raid over 2 centuries, to learn that all your preparation, all your weapons, all your confidence meant nothing when you entered their domain. Today, we're going to explore what it was really like to face the most ruthless raiders in American history. Welcome to Valor and Violence. To understand what Nelson Lee faced that April night, you need to understand the Comanche. And to understand the Comanche, you need to understand what they were before the horse, because that transformation explains everything. In the early 1600s, the Comanche were nobody, a small Shoshonean band pushed into the least desirable territories by stronger tribes. They had no impressive mythology, no grand temples, no artistic traditions. They were nomads struggling to survive in a harsh world where other groups had already claimed the best hunting grounds. If you'd asked a Spanish explorer in 1600 which Native American tribe would dominate the continent 2 centuries later, the Comanche wouldn't have made the list. Then came the horse. Spanish conquistadors brought horses to Mexico in the 1500s. By the 1600s, those horses had spread north. Some escaped, some were stolen, some were traded. The Apache got them first. As a semi-agricultural people, they used horses to expand their power, raiding Spanish settlements and dominating the southern Great Plains from modern New Mexico down through Texas. But the Apache never fully committed to the horse. They still farmed, still built permanent camps, still divided their attention. The Comanche had no such hesitation. As pure nomads, they adopted the horse completely, utterly, fanatically. They didn't just ride horses. They became one with them. Comanche children learned to ride before they could walk properly. Warriors could shoot arrows accurately at full gallop, hanging off the side of their mounts to use the horse's body as a shield. They could cover 300 miles in a matter of days, moving faster than any enemy could track or pursue. The horse transformed the Comanche from outcasts into the most formidable fighting force in North America. By the 1700s, they had driven the Apache completely off the Great Plains, pushed them into the mountains, taken everything. Their territory, which they called Comancheria, stretched from Kansas south through western Texas and New Mexico, 250,000 square miles of the most inhospitable land on the continent. Land that killed settlers through heat, drought, and distance. Land the Comanche controlled absolutely. The Spanish learned this the hard way. March 16, 1758, Mission San Saba in what's now central Texas. The Spanish had been tricked. Apache leaders had promised they wanted to be Christianized, convinced the Spanish to build a mission in Presidio deep in Comanche territory. What the Apache actually wanted was to start a war between two of their enemies. They got their wish. That morning, Spanish soldiers woke to war. They rushed to the walls of the Presidio and looked out at something that would haunt Spanish nightmares for generations. 2,000 mounted Comanche warriors. Historian T.R. Fehrenbach wrote in his book Comanche, "The history of a people, what those Spanish soldiers saw." Quote, "The savages were a breathtaking barbaric spectacle, masses of mounted Indians in the full panoply of war. The long lines of riders wore fantastic headdresses of plumes, deer antlers, and bison horns. Their faces were painted red and black, the colors of death." End quote. The Comanche pretended to be peaceful at first. Then they turned their attention to the mission near the fort. The Spanish commanders, safe behind their walls, watched helplessly as the Comanches slaughtered 8 priests and burned the mission to the ground. As a show of strength, the war party hung around for days, just outside cannon range. They killed the Spanish cattle. They demonstrated complete control. Then they left. Message delivered, this is Comanche territory. You're here because we allow it. But here's what made the Comanche truly dangerous. They were brilliant tacticians, masters of the raid. When war parties assembled, they gathered intelligence first, watched their targets, waited for perfect conditions. The best time for raids was spring, when the grass had grown tall enough to feed their horses on long journeys. They preferred full moons for night travel, something other tribes like the Apache had taboos against. Settlers learned to dread the combination. When the grass grew and the moon waxed full, danger rode toward them. They called it the Comanche moon. The raids were swift, precise, devastating. The goal wasn't always slaughter, it was resources. Horses, weapons, supplies, sometimes captives. But terror was always part of the equation. Terror kept enemies off balance, made them afraid to pursue, created a psychological advantage that was worth more than any number of warriors. And if you did pursue, the stories rarely ended well. The Comanche knew every water source, every canyon, every hiding spot across Comancheria. They'd run off your horses, leave you stranded on the high plains. Without transportation, without water, you'd die of exposure and dehydration. That was if you were lucky. Capture meant torture. Elaborate, creative, designed to test how much pain a man could endure before breaking. By 1785, even the Spanish had to adapt. They were being raided constantly by both Comanche and Apache. Different strategies, different tribes, same result: Spanish settlements were bleeding. The governor in San Antonio, Domingo Cabello, wrote that year, quote, "There is no instant, day or night, when reports of barbarities and disorders do not arrive from the ranches. Totally unprotected as we are, this can only result in the complete destruction and loss of this province," end quote. So the Spanish made a deal with the devil they knew. An officer named Juan Bautista de Anza managed to earn Comanche respect through successful military actions. He used their own tactics against them. Mounted warfare, swift strikes. In 1785, he convinced several Comanche bands to meet at Taos. The resulting treaty changed everything. The Comanche agreed to stop attacking the Spanish. Trade would open up, and most importantly, the Comanche would help the Spanish destroy the Apache. For the next decade, it was a slaughter. In January 1790, Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a combined force of Spanish, Comanche, and Wichita warriors against the Lipan Apache. They trapped hundreds of Apache warriors in a canyon west of San Antonio and killed them all. After that campaign, the Lipan Apache had fewer than 1,000 warriors left total. They abandoned the plains forever, retreating into the mountains. The Comanche had completed their conquest. The most powerful tribe in North America. Then came the Americans. By the 1800s, westward expansion was inevitable. Manifest destiny demanded the United States stretch from Atlantic to Pacific. But there was a problem. Right in the middle sat Comancheria, a vast territory that couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be tricked, controlled by warriors who had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of mounted warfare. Settlers came anyway. The promise of land drew thousands into Texas. Towns sprouted, ranches spread, and the Comanche noticed. These new targets were soft, isolated, rich with horses and supplies. Some estimates suggest that in certain years, during the 1830s and 40s, as many as 200 settlers were killed. The true number was likely higher. Many deaths went unrecorded in the chaos of the frontier. Men like Nelson Lee should have known better. The maps of the time literally labeled central Texas and New Mexico as, quote, range of the Comanches, end quote. But Lee was a veteran, Navy man, Texas Ranger, Mexican warfighter. He'd seen combat. He thought experience and preparation would be enough. In early March 1855, he and William Aikens assembled a caravan of 19 men to drive mules from Corpus Christi west to California. The route went straight through Comanche territory. They knew it. They went anyway. Profit made men brave. Or stupid. They'd been traveling for weeks, moving slowly along the Rio Grande, where grass grew for the mules. In early April, they stopped southwest of El Paso to rest the animals. They posted sentinels every night. They stayed alert. They followed all the rules. The Comanche were already watching. Waiting for the right moment, the spring grass had grown. The moon was full. Every condition was perfect. Nelson Lee had no idea he was already prey. The journey had started with optimism. That dangerous frontier optimism that convinced reasonable men to do unreasonable things. Nelson Lee and William Aikens stood in Corpus Christi in early March of 1855, looking at their herd of mules and seeing nothing but profit. California was booming. Gold had created demand for everything. Mules that sold for $20 in Texas could fetch 10 times that on the West Coast. All they had to do was get them there. The route was the problem, or should have been. From Corpus Christi, the most direct path west ran through the heart of Comanche territory. Every map said so. Every experienced frontiersman warned against it. The region between Texas and California was labeled with brutal honesty. Range of the Comanches. But Aikens was convinced they could manage it safely. They'd hire good men, stay alert, move quickly. The potential profit made the risk seem acceptable. Lee, who'd survived naval combat and fought in the Mexican War, figured his experience counted for something. He'd faced danger before and lived. So they recruited. 17 additional men signed on. Some needed work. Some craved adventure. Some, like Lee, believed their competence would protect them. By early March, they had their crew. 19 men total. Well supplied, heavily armed. The mules were healthy, the weather was turning favorable, and everyone believed they knew what they were doing. They left Corpus Christi heading west. The plan was to follow the Rio Grande where possible. The river meant water. Water meant grass. Grass meant the mules could graze as they traveled. It was smart logistics. Everything by the book. Lee invested in one more piece of equipment before they left. A pocket watch. Not just any pocket watch, but one with an alarm function. A marvel of modern engineering. He was determined to run this operation with military precision. Every morning at 3:30, that watch would chime. He'd wake the camp. They'd break down, load up, and be moving by first light. Regimented schedules meant efficiency. Efficiency meant speed. Speed meant less time exposed to danger. The early days went smoothly. Too smoothly. The kind of smooth that makes you forget why you were worried in the first place. They covered ground steadily, the mules behaving, the weather cooperating. Each night they made camp, posted sentinels, maintained watch rotations, professional, careful, exactly as planned. By late March, they'd reached the territory southwest of El Paso. The landscape had changed. Fewer trees, more scrub brush. The kind of open country where you could see for miles during the day, but couldn't see anything at night. They were deep in Comancheria now, though the vast emptiness made it easy to believe they were alone. In early April, Aikens made the decision to stop for a few weeks. The mules needed rest. Hard travel wore them down, and exhausted animals meant slower progress or dead animals. Neither was acceptable. They found a decent spot along the Rio Grande. Water nearby, some grazing, defensible enough. That's when the routine really set in. Wake at 3:30. Break camp. Move the herd to fresh grass. Set up again. Post sentinels. Sleep. Repeat. Day after day. The monotony was almost comforting. Nothing happened. No raids. No attacks. No sign of any Comanche presence at all. The men started to relax. You could see it in the way they joked around the campfires. The way the sentinels sometimes got sloppy, their attention wandering. 19 armed men, confident in their numbers and their weapons. What did they have to fear? They didn't know they were being watched. The Comanche didn't just stumble onto targets. They scouted, observed, learned patterns, counted weapons, identified leaders, waited for the perfect moment. A war party had likely been shadowing Lee's caravan for days, maybe weeks, staying far enough back to avoid detection, moving only at night. Patient. The conditions in early April were ideal. The spring grass had grown thick. The Comanche moon was approaching full. Their horses would have plenty to eat during and after the raid. The moonlight would guide them during their approach and escape. Everything aligned. On April 1st, the routine continued as normal. Lee woke at 3:30 to his watch alarm, roused the men, they moved through the day's work, tended the mules, kept watch. Nothing unusual. The sunset was unremarkable. As darkness fell, they posted the sentinels and settled in for another night. April 2nd began the same way. Lee took the late sentry shift, walking the perimeter from around midnight until 1 o'clock in the morning. His boots crunched on the dry ground. The mules dozed. The Rio Grande murmured softly in the darkness. The moon hung fat and bright above, casting enough light to see shapes, but not details. He scanned the scrub brush beyond the camp, the scattered mesquite trees, the endless expanse of plain. Nothing moved. No sounds except the natural ones. Wind, water, the occasional animal in the distance. At 1 o'clock his relief arrived. Lee returned to camp, his body heavy with fatigue. He pulled out his pocket watch, wound it carefully, set the alarm for 3:30. The tiny mechanism ticked in his palm, precise and reliable, a small piece of civilization in the wilderness. He tucked the watch into his vest, within easy reach for the morning, crawled into his bedroll. The camp was quiet now, most of the men already asleep. A few embers glowed in the fire pits. The sentinels were posted at the perimeter, though Lee couldn't see them in the darkness. He closed his eyes. The watch ticked softly beside him. Somewhere out in the darkness, painted warriors were moving into position, silent, invisible, expert. The last seconds of Nelson Lee's old life were counting down. He had no idea. The screaming shattered everything. Lee's eyes snapped open. His brain struggled to process what he was hearing. Not shouts, not yells. Screaming. The kind that comes from absolute terror and unbearable pain. The kind that tells you something has gone catastrophically wrong. He lurched upward, instinct taking over. His hand found his rifle in the darkness. He was halfway to his feet when the rope caught him. It looped around his chest like a living thing, yanking him sideways with such force that his shoulder slammed into the ground. The rifle flew from his grip, disappearing into the darkness. Before he could cry out, before he could even understand what was happening, weight crashed down on him. Hands, multiple hands, pinning him face down in the dirt. His arms were wrenched behind his back with brutal efficiency. Rawhide bit into his wrists. His ankles were bound next. The entire process took maybe 10 seconds. He couldn't see, could barely breathe with his face pressed into the earth. But he could hear war whoops, not like anything he'd heard before, high-pitched, ululating, designed to freeze the blood. Between the whoops came the sounds of men dying, the wet thud of tomahawks meeting flesh, gurgling screams cut short, the crash of supplies being overturned, horses whinnying in panic. The camp smelled of wood smoke and dust, and now something else. Copper. Blood. Lee managed to turn his head slightly. In the dim glow of dying campfires, he caught glimpses. Dark figures, moving with purpose, through the tents. Painted skin, reflecting firelight. One warrior's face passed close enough for Lee to see. Black paint. Completely black, making him look demonic, inhuman, like death itself had taken physical form. The chaos was total. Lee's mind raced through impossible questions. Where were the sentinels? How had a war party gotten this close without any warning? How many attackers were there? In the darkness and confusion, he couldn't tell. They seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. A boot stepped inches from his face. He heard Thomas Martin screaming somewhere to his left, then silence. Another voice he recognized, can't remember the name, begging in English, that his captors couldn't understand or didn't care about. More thuds, more silence. The attack lasted perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less. When you're bound on the ground listening to your friends being butchered, time loses all meaning. Each second stretches into an hour. Each sound burns itself into memory. Then, as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. The war whoops faded to commands in a guttural language Lee didn't recognize. He could hear movement, supplies being gathered, horses being rounded up, and underneath it all, groaning, whimpering, the sounds of men who weren't quite dead yet. Rough hands grabbed Lee by the shoulders and hauled him upright. His legs buckled. Two warriors held him up while another cut the bonds on his ankles. He stood there, swaying, wrists still tied behind his back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The camp was destroyed. Tents slashed open and collapsed. Supplies scattered across the ground. And bodies. He forced his eyes across the carnage, counting silently. 1, 3, 5, 8. Bodies everywhere. Some still, some twitching. Most mutilated beyond recognition. 3 other men stood near him, also bound. William Akins, his face gray with shock. Thomas Martin, blood running down his forehead from a gash. John Stewart shaking so violently Lee could hear his teeth chattering. 4 survivors out of 19 men. A warrior barked commands and gestured at the captives. Other Comanche moved forward and began cutting away their clothes with knives. Everything. Stripped completely naked in the cold April air. Then buckskin garments were thrown at their feet. A shirt, leggings, moccasins. Put these on. The message needed no translation. Lee's hands trembled as he dressed. His mind couldn't stop replaying it. The sentinels. Where were the sentinels? He'd posted them himself. Good men, alert men. Had they fallen asleep? Been killed first? The Comanche must have taken them out silently before launching the main attack. The level of skill required for that was staggering. As dawn began to gray the eastern horizon, Lee could finally see his captors clearly. Maybe 20 warriors, possibly 30. In the darkness they'd seemed like 100. Each was painted for war. Red and black predominating. Some wore buffalo horn headdresses. Others had deer antlers. Their horses stood calm nearby, already loaded with plunder from the camp. Then Lee heard it. A cheerful mechanical sound. Tiny bells chiming in sequence. His pocket watch, still in his vest, which now lay trampled in the dirt near his bedroll. The alarm he'd set before sleeping. 3:30 in the morning, right on schedule, precise, reliable, absurdly punctual. A young warrior picked up the vest curiously, shook it. The chiming continued. His eyes widened. He called to the others in excitement. Warriors gathered around this strange object that sang on its own. They'd seen white man's tools before: guns, knives, compasses. But this was different. Magic. One of them, clearly a leader based on the deference shown by others, grabbed the vest and approached Lee. He thrust it forward, gesturing emphatically. "Make it do that again." And Nelson Lee, standing in buckskin among the mutilated corpses of his companions, took the watch with bound hands and demonstrated how to wind it, how to set the alarm. The warriors crowded close, fascinated. Some touched the watch gently, reverently, as if it might bite. When it chimed again on command, several jumped back. Then they laughed. Actually laughed. The surreal horror of that moment would stay with Lee forever, teaching his captors party tricks while bodies cooled nearby. But he understood something crucial in that instant. His survival depended on being interesting, on having value beyond what could be taken from his corpse. As the sun rose fully, the Comanche finished their work. They loaded their horses with rifles, powder, shot, blankets, tools, everything useful, everything portable. The mules were gathered, probably 40 animals total between what they'd captured here and what they'd stolen elsewhere. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed. Smashed water barrels, slashed spare canvas, scattered flour and beans across the ground. Then came the final desecration. Warriors moved among the dead with knives. Lee forced himself to watch, knowing he needed to understand these people if he was going to survive them. They took scalps. Quick, efficient cuts. The hair came away with a wet sound. Fresh scalps were hung from belts or tied to horses. But they did more than that. Bodies were mutilated. Not randomly. Ritually. Arms hacked off. Torsos opened. Tongues cut out and pierced with sharp sticks. Lee remembered the words of another captive he'd once met, describing a similar scene. Quote, "The scene was cold and heartrending. They had cut and hacked the poor cold bodies in the most brutal manner. Some had their arms and hands chopped off. Others were disemboweled. And still others had their tongues drawn out and sharp sticks thrust through them. All the dead were scalped, and the scalps, still fresh, were dangling from the savages' belts." End quote. This wasn't mindless brutality. It was communication. A message for whoever found this camp next. This is what happens when you enter Comancheria uninvited. This is the price of trespassing. This is what we can do. The 4 captives were forced to watch it all. Part of the lesson. Part of breaking them down psychologically before the real captivity even began. By mid-morning, the war party was ready to move. The captives' hands were bound to lead ropes. They would walk. The Comanche would ride. They headed north into the vast emptiness of the high plains, leaving behind a scene of such complete destruction that whoever found it would struggle to believe 19 armed men had camped there just hours before. As they walked, Lee's mind turned to something he'd heard from other survivors of Comanche raids. The attack was just the beginning. What came next was worse. He thought about Rachel Parker Plummer. She'd survived a Comanche raid 19 years earlier at Parker Fort. Her story was legendary on the frontier. On May 19, 1836, Rachel had been 17, married, already a mother to an 18-month-old son. Her family had built a massive fort in Limestone County, Texas. 12-foot walls, 2 blockhouses, meant to be impregnable. That morning had been peaceful. Her father, husband, and brother were working the fields. Rachel was inside the fort, doing chores, playing with her baby. Around 10 o'clock, someone shouted from the fields, "Indians." Rachel ran to the blockhouse and looked over the wall. She wrote in her memoir what she saw, and her words captured the essential truth of what it meant to face the Comanche. Quote, "One minute the fields were clear, and the next moment more Indians than I dreamed possible were in front of the fort." End quote. Hundreds of mounted warriors, appearing from nowhere, as if the earth itself had birthed them. The Comanche raised a white flag. The Apache got them first. As a semi-agricultural people, they used horses to expand their power, raiding Spanish settlements and dominating the southern Great Plains, from modern New Mexico down through Texas. But the Apache never fully committed to the horse. They still farmed, still built permanent camps, still divided their attention. The Comanche had no such hesitation. As pure nomads, they adopted the horse completely, utterly, fanatically. They didn't just ride horses. Benjamin knew what they were really after. The Comanche always knew where water was. This was theater. Then the pretense ended. The war party attacked. Benjamin was killed immediately. Silas Parker made his stand at the gate. He was determined to take some of them with him. And he did. Rachel later learned that Silas had killed 4 Comanche warriors before they brought him down. They mutilated his body as a mark of respect. A warrior who fought well earned a warrior's desecration. The Comanche swept through the fort. 5 settlers were killed that day. Another 5 were taken captive, including Rachel, her infant son, and a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. 23 others managed to escape in the chaos. About 2/3 survival rate. That was actually common in Comanche raids. Killing everyone wasn't usually the point. Terror and resources were the goals. Rachel's captivity lasted 2 years. 2 years of being beaten, worked, brutalized in ways that made even hardened frontiersmen turn away when they read her account. She was pregnant when captured. The Comanche forced her to work throughout the pregnancy. When she gave birth, they killed the infant. A baby interfered with her labor. She was forced to watch, but Rachel had something many captives lacked: spirit. At one point, when being mistreated by a Comanche woman, she fought back, actually fought, won the fight. The Comanche, who valued courage above almost everything, began to respect her after that. Not enough to free her, but enough to keep her alive. Eventually, she was sold to a trader. Made her way back to her family in 1838. She wrote her narrative twice, desperate to tell her story, to warn others, to make sense of what had happened to her. In 1839, she died. Likely complications from giving birth to her 3rd child. She was 20 years old. Her son, captured with her, was ransomed back separately. The 9-year-old girl, Cynthia Ann Parker, was never ransomed. She grew up Comanche, married a chief named Nocona, had children. One of them, Quanah Parker, would become the last war chief of the Comanche. The final leader before the tribe was forced onto reservations. The irony was savage. The girl captured in the raid that made the Comanche infamous would bear the son who would lead them in their final years of freedom. Nelson Lee thought about all this as he walked north into captivity. He thought about Herman Lehman, another captive whose story he'd heard. The Comanche had once captured a buffalo hunter. The man was so terrified he fell to his knees, begging for mercy. The Comanche, who despised cowardice, decided to have sport with him. They stripped him, dressed him in a war bonnet, tied so tight he couldn't remove it, then told him in signs to run back to his white friends. The hunter ran. When his fellow settlers saw a figure in a war bonnet sprinting toward them, they assumed it was an Indian. They shot him full of holes before realizing their mistake. The Comanche watched from a distance, laughing. The creativity of it. The psychological warfare. Making whites kill their own. That was what Lee faced now. A people who had perfected not just warfare, but the art of breaking minds as thoroughly as bodies. Who had spent 2 centuries expanding their territory through violence so effective, so overwhelming, that it became their cultural identity. Each generation more committed to the warrior path than the last. The horse and the raid weren't just tools. They were who the Comanche were at their core. As the sun climbed higher and the camp disappeared behind them, Lee understood a fundamental truth. He wasn't a captive because of bad luck. He was a captive because he'd entered the domain of the most formidable light cavalry the world had ever seen. Warriors who could cover 300 miles in days, who knew every water source, every canyon, every hiding place, across 250,000 square miles, who treated the high plains like their personal hunting ground. And men like him were the prey. Nelson Lee survived. Against all probability, against the odds that killed 15 of his companions that April night, he survived. 3 years. 3 years of captivity among the Comanche. 3 years of learning their language, understanding their ways, enduring tortures designed to test whether a man had courage worth respecting or cowardice worth despising. In 1858, he escaped. The details of how remain murky in his later writings, perhaps deliberately so. Escaped captives rarely wanted to explain exactly how they'd gotten away, fearing it might endanger others still held or future captives who might try the same methods. What mattered was that Lee made it back to white civilization. And unlike many survivors who tried to forget, who buried their trauma and never spoke of it, Lee wrote it all down. His book, 3 Years Among the Comanches, published in 1859, became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what captivity meant, what it felt like to be hunted, to be broken down. To watch torture ceremonies where captives were tied to poles and cut with stone knives while the tribe watched and evaluated how well they bore pain. Lee described 4 prisoners in one ceremony, 2 of them scalped alive. The Comanche dancing around them, testing their character through agony, before finally ending it with an axe to the head. The true mark of bravery, Lee learned, was how you dealt with pain. The Comanche were eager to test that in every man they captured. But Lee's story was just one among hundreds, maybe thousands. The true number of those taken, those killed, those who simply disappeared into the vastness of Comancheria will never be known. Record keeping on the frontier was sporadic at best. A raid might kill 5 people or 50. A family might vanish and no one would know for months, years, ever. What we do know is the pattern. The Parker Fort Massacre. The San Saba Raid. The Great Raid of 1840, when Comanche warriors rode all the way to the Texas coast, penetrating farther south than any raid before it. Dozens of smaller attacks, hundreds of individual encounters. The cumulative weight of 2 centuries of Comanche dominance. At Parker Fort, the survival rate had actually been high. 5 killed, 5 captured, 23 escaped. Roughly 2/3 survival. That was common in Comanche raids because killing wasn't always the primary objective. Resources were, horses especially, weapons, supplies, captives who could be ransomed or enslaved or adopted, and terror. Always terror. The psychological impact of a raid was worth more than any amount of bloodshed. Leave survivors. Let them tell the story. Let fear spread faster than any war party could ride. The ransomed captives who made it back often wished they hadn't. Rachel Parker Plummer lived less than a year after her return, her body broken by 2 years of captivity and constant brutalization. She'd fought to survive, earned a measure of respect, endured the murder of her infant. She'd written her account twice, desperate to make people understand. Then she died at 20, her 3rd childbirth proving too much for a frame that had already suffered beyond what anyone should endure. Her nephew, the infant son captured with her, was eventually ransomed separately. He lived, grew up, tried to forget. But Cynthia Ann Parker never came back. Not really. She grew up Comanche, married Peta Nocona, a chief and renowned warrior. Bore him children, including a son named Quanah. In 1860, Texas Rangers raided a Comanche camp and, quote, rescued, end quote, Cynthia Ann. By then, she was in her mid-30s. She'd spent 24 years with the Comanche, more than twice as long as she'd lived with whites. She never readjusted, tried repeatedly to escape back to the Comanche, mourned her husband, killed in the raid that, quote, freed, end quote, her. In 1870, she died, likely by her own hand, starved herself. The tragedy of it was absolute. Captured as a child, grew to love her captors, recaptured as an adult, died longing for the people who'd killed her birth family. Her son, Quanah, avoided capture during that 1860 raid. He grew up to become the last free war chief of the Comanche. He led his people through their final years of resistance before the inevitable happened. The buffalo were slaughtered. The territory was overrun. The military pressure became impossible to resist. In 1875, Quanah Parker led the last free Comanche onto the reservation at Fort Sill. The cycle was complete. The girl captured in the raid that made the Comanche infamous bore the son who would surrender their freedom. But even in defeat, even in the long twilight of reservation life, the Comanche had made their mark. The military attempts to subdue them had largely failed. Punitive expeditions sent into Comancheria often came back empty-handed, or didn't come back at all. The high plains swallowed cavalry units whole. Horses would be run off in the night. Men would die of thirst. The Comanche would appear, strike, vanish like smoke. The Spanish had learned this in the 1700s, had finally made peace, allied with the Comanche against the Apache. That alliance had worked. In January 1790, Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a combined force of Spanish, Comanche, and Wichita against the Lipan Apache. The Comanche, who valued courage above almost everything, began to respect her after that. Not enough to free her, but enough to keep her alive. Eventually, she was sold to a trader, made her way back to her family in 1838. She wrote her narrative twice, desperate to tell her story, to warn others. to make sense of what had happened to her. In 1839, she died. Likely complications from giving birth to her third child. She was 20 years old. It worked eventually, but not because of military superiority. It worked because of numbers. Endless waves of settlers. The railroad, the systematic slaughter of the buffalo herds that sustained the Comanche way of life. You couldn't outfight the Comanche on the plains. No one could. But you could destroy the ecosystem that made their lifestyle possible. Kill the buffalo, and you killed the Comanche. Not as individuals. As a culture, the cost was staggering on all sides. S.C. They trapped hundreds of Apache warriors in a canyon west of San Antonio. Slaughtered them. Left the Lipan with fewer than 1,000 warriors total. The Apache had abandoned the plains entirely after that, retreating into the mountains, their power on the Great Plains broken forever. The Americans tried similar tactics in the 1860s. General James Carleton instituted policies of extermination in New Mexico and Arizona. Hunt them down, kill them, drive them out, to spend years as a captive, beaten, worked, brutalized, to escape or be ransomed and find that you no longer fit anywhere, too damaged for white society, too white for the Comanche, or what it meant from the other side. To see your hunting grounds invaded, your way of life threatened, to fight back the only way you knew how, with the tools and tactics that had made you powerful. To watch it all slip away anyway as the buffalo disappeared and the soldiers kept coming and the reservations became inevitable. There were no simple heroes in this story. No uncomplicated villains. Just people caught in historical forces larger than themselves, acting according to their cultures, their values, their understanding of the world, causing tremendous suffering while suffering tremendously themselves. Herman Lehman understood this better than most. Captured by Apache as a child, later adopted by Comanche, eventually returned to his white family. He never fully belonged anywhere, but Quanah Parker's family adopted him formally, enrolled him as a tribal member. He received government benefits as a Comanche, visited them frequently. In the end, he'd rejoined his birth family, but never lost the Comanche. Maybe that was the real legacy. Not the raids or the battles or the body counts, but the way these cultures crashed into each other and created people who belonged nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Living contradictions, walking reminders that the collision of civilizations leaves scars that never fully heal. Nelson Lee carried his scars until he died. So did Rachel Parker Plummer in her brief remaining life. So did every survivor on both sides who lived through those years when Comancheria was contested ground and the outcome was still uncertain. The Comanche won for 2 centuries, then they lost forever, and the price of both victory and defeat was measured in trauma that echoed through generations. His book, 3 Years Among the Comanches, published in 1859, became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what captivity meant, what it felt like to be hunted, to be broken down, to watch torture ceremonies where captives were tied to poles and cut with stone knives, while the tribe watched and evaluated how well they bore pain. Lee described 4 prisoners in one ceremony, 2 of them scalped alive. Then the Comanche taught him the difference between fighting a battle and being prey, between facing an enemy and facing extinction. 15 of his companions died that night. 4 survived. The mathematics were simple, but the reality was incomprehensible. One moment, you're a free man with a future. The next, you're bound captive, watching your friends being mutilated while you demonstrate your pocket watch for your captors. The absurdity of it, the horror, the absolute reversal of everything you thought was true about the world. Rachel Parker Plummer learned the same lesson at 17. One minute, the fields were clear. The next, more warriors than she'd dreamed possible. Her uncle Benjamin died trying to buy time. Her uncle Silas died fighting, taking 4 Comanche with him. She spent 2 years in captivity that broke her body and spirit so thoroughly she died at 23 years after her rescue. But here's what we have to understand. This wasn't about inherent brutality on either side. The Comanche weren't evil. The settlers weren't innocent. This was about 2 civilizations colliding with incompatible claims to the same land. The Comanche had built their entire culture around the horse and the raid over 200 years. Each generation more committed than the last. It wasn't something they did. It was who they were. And the settlers? They came because manifest destiny told them the continent was theirs. Because land meant opportunity. Because they believed in expansion as surely as the Comanche believed in defending Comancheria. The tragedy is that both sides were acting according to their values, their understanding of justice, their vision of the future. And the collision produced suffering on a scale that still echoes. Quanah Parker, born of that collision, surrendered the last free Comanche in 1875, the son of a captured white girl and a Comanche chief. The embodiment of everything complicated about this history. He led his people onto the reservation knowing it was over. The buffalo were gone. The territory was overrun. Resistance meant extinction. Herman Lehman, white by birth, Apache and Comanche by upbringing, enrolled as a tribal member by choice, spent his life belonging nowhere completely and everywhere partially. Never fully white, never fully Comanche. Always both, always neither. These stories don't have clean endings. They don't offer simple lessons. What they offer is truth. The Comanche were the most formidable light cavalry in North American history. For 2 centuries, entering their territory meant risking everything. Being hunted by them meant facing warriors who knew every inch of ground, who could cover 300 miles in days, who had refined terror into an art form. Settlers came anyway, died anyway, were captured anyway. Some survived. Most carried scars forever. And in the end, the Comanche were forced onto reservations and the frontier closed and the era ended. But the stories remain. Rachel's memoir, Lee's account, Quanah's leadership, Herman's impossible identity. Reminders that history is written in individual lives, not abstract forces. That being hunted meant specific terrors for specific people on specific days. April 2nd, 1855. Nelson Lee set his alarm for 3:30 and went to sleep safe. He woke to screams and spent 3 years learning what it meant to be prey. That was the reality of facing the Comanche. Not legend, not mythology, reality. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand more about the Comanche Wars, the Apache conflicts, or other stories from the frontier, check out the other videos on this channel and leave a comment. What aspects of this history should we explore next? What stories need to be told? The past isn't simple, but it's always worth understanding. Welcome to history. Welcome to valor and violence.